Okay, I'm here with Dick Russell. Dick, it's really nice to meet you, and I'm really glad that you could make the time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be with you today.
Well, we're here on the occasion of the release of Volume 2 of your biography of James Hillman. And as people who listen to the podcast know, I'm very interested in Hillman's ideas. He's probably been the most influential psychologist in my life. And I'm really looking forward to digging into Volume 2. It gets into how his work developed, and that's what I'm most interested in. Uh, now, a little bit of background for people listening, and I think it's just an amazing story too, how your meeting with Hillman occurred and how he was an influence or mentor in your life, and particularly in your relationship with your son. But if we could go back to when you first met Hillman, how did that come about?
Okay, well, it was the late 1990s, and I live with a large group of friends. We've been sharing a life together for many years, and we had discovered Hillman's work when I was much younger. When I quit my dream job when I was at 21 years old. I'd gone to work for Sports Illustrated magazine in New York, and it was the late 1960s and early 1970s. My interests had moved beyond sports, and I realized there was a lot of things going on in the culture. There was the Vietnam War and civil rights movement, and my friends were hippies. And anyway, I took off with a backpack and a portable typewriter and roamed around the world for a year and a half. And while I was doing that early on in Liverpool, actually, I discovered Carl Jung. And he had I started writing down all these quotes from Jung, and as I was just hanging out in Liverpool and realizing something about my life through him, that I was something about my destiny, and I felt I had some kind of destiny, right? That I was supposed to explore and illuminate darker forces or shadows, or the unconscious parts of society, and that actually proved true of much of my writing career after that. But then we were reading Hillman, and we were started with A Blue Fire, which was excerpts from a lot of his early writings that Tom Moore put together, and was very impressed by him. And we used to kind of have study groups talking about him and stuff. And then one day, there was a young fellow who'd grown up in our family, whose father had left and was an organic farmer in Connecticut. We were talking about Hillman, and he said, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him his organic vegetables in the marketplace in Connecticut." I said, "Wow." I said, so I called my old friend Wayne Hanson, and I said, "Wayne, do you think I might be able to meet James Hillman sometime?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. He's very private, but I sent him a copy of my second book, which was called Black Genius and the American Experience." And he liked the format of it a lot. It had chapters about ancestors and comparative chapters like Frederick Douglass with James Baldwin, 100 years apart, those kinds of things, and the importance of family and mentors in the African American tradition. And I have a son who's biracial, and so I was kind of writing it with the idea that someday he would read it and gain from learning about these people. So anyway, Hillman liked it, and we ended up having lunch together. His not his wife yet, but my wife and I and Wayne, and we just hit it off. We found we had many common interests. We both traveled widely in Africa when we were young. We both loved boxing, actually, and I'd known Muhammad Ali, and so we had a lot to talk about, and nothing about psychology. I mean, I never studied psychology in school. I was an investigative journalist, basically. So that was the very first time I met him, and I'd be happy to outline further our relationship, because I certainly did not start out to be his biographer.
Hmm. Were you at Sports Illustrated when I think George Lois did that cover of Muhammad Ali as Saint Sebastian? You know the one I'm talking about, that black and white photo where he's got the
Yeah,
arrows in him?
yeah, I think I do. I think I do. Yes, I was there. Well, early in the 1970 was when I left in 1970 in the spring. So, and I came to know Ali later, quite well actually.
Hmm.
It was a wonderful part of my life, getting to go to his training camp and hang out with him, and go to the second Frazier fight, and later do a story on him for TV Guide magazine when I worked for them. So yeah, it was he was quite a. I've been blessed with meeting some amazing people in my life.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I've heard you talk about different stories of your life, and it's really fascinating. But, one of Hillman's kind of central ideas that he put forward in The Soul's Code was the acorn theory, which is an old Neoplatonic idea that we come into this life with our destiny already in place, and there's a daimon that accompanies us that tries to steer us along the right path. Now, you talked about being like 2021 and feeling like you were destined to something else. How did your acorn start to reveal itself to you?
Well, it was there was a thread that I have followed, I guess, most of my life, which is I don't know quite how to describe it. It's like at that point in my life, I knew that my life had moved beyond just sports, and I called this friend of mine and who I'd gone to college with and said, it's great being here, and they're kind of weaning me to run this magazine someday. I was just a kid really, and writing Baseball's Week, and I said, but I know that it'll kill my soul. I've got to do something else. I've got to get out. I left the country. I traveled for a year and a half with a backpack and a portable typewriter. Back in the days, you could hitchhike everywhere in Europe and Africa and the Middle East, and had some really profound, life-changing experiences. And I don't know. I've always felt I had things that happened to me over there that foretold what I was going to do later. I don't know how else to put it. And I came to believe in that, that there was a soul's code, even though I didn't know that word really yet, or Hillman hadn't even written his book until the mid 1990s. But I felt it somehow that I would almost like there was a guiding spirit, or would call it a daimon, or a higher self, or something that was there guiding me, thankfully, toward not just a conventional life, but leading me to live with a group of friends I've been living with for years, um, just to opening new doors that kind of, I don't know, going back, I'll just tell one brief story that I've thought about over the years was that when I was a little boy, I had a recurring dream that I was approaching a doorway, and beyond the doorway was very dark and scary and mysterious, and I was really afraid to walk through it, but I knew that on the other side of that doorway were mysteries that I somehow had to explore. And in my later life, I did a book, spent 2.5 years researching the Kennedy assassination, for example, and was the first investigative journalist to really do that, and interviewed some very dangerous people, I guess you'd say. I had the CIA following me, I was told, and stuff like that. So, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Hmm.
my life has always taken me. I've been blessed to write about things that I really cared about, and to explore mysteries like eventually the environment. I got into writing about the environment for many, many years, and still do, and wrote a book called Eye of the Whale about these friendly gray whales in Mexico that come up to you in a small boat mysteriously. Started in the 1970s. Nobody knows why. And in this little lagoon where the gray whales came to have their young, the mothers would introduce the newborns to you, and you'd be petting them in the wild before they made their migration back. At the time when their habitat was threatened by this incursion by Mitsubishi and the Mexican government to build this big salt works there. So I ended up writing a book about all this and following their migration all the way to Russia back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So that too was this mystery that somehow um, I was compelled to delve into and explore.
Hmm. Was there something you could point to in your upbringing that gave you the courage to start following these threads so early? Because, like so many of us, I didn't kind of snap out of it until I was in my mid 30s, and I left advertising, and because I felt like it was destroying my soul, and started on a new trajectory. But that took quite some time and a lot of suffering to get to that point. Now, for you to be following these urgings at 2021, leaving this dream job and heading out into the great unknown, it must have taken a lot of like faith and courage, no?
Yes, I mean, I never considered myself, I wasn't doing this because I was some courageous risk taker, but I will say I was very successful very young at what I did and sort of reached the top, I guess, at a time when all these other things were happening and I was being influenced by them and realizing that somehow this was not what I was going to do with my life. And so was that a higher power guiding me? Or, I believe it probably was in a sense. Um, but so I just threw it all away. I mean, my parents thought I was crazy. My younger brother, who's a very successful businessman, couldn't believe I did it. Um, and I was a Midwestern kid. I was raised, upper middle class, suburban Kansas City, born in Minneapolis. I wasn't, a West Coaster or an East Coast kid, and went to University of Kansas. And but something happened to me, and that pushed me onto that literal road, and I guess I never looked back.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so meeting Hillman, what were your first impressions of him?
Well, first of all, that he was just, although he was obviously brilliant, and I knew that from reading him, he was a regular, he was very down to earth in certain ways. He just loved to talk about everyday things but take things to a deeper level, and so he was a lot of fun to be with. He was funny. He years later he signed. I remember soon after he signed a copy of one of his books to my wife, and this was actually after we got to know him, and he started visiting our homes, and we got to know each other better. And he wrote, "We were brought together not by fate, but by its instrument, Wayne's potato," meaning my organic farmer friend, right? So, I mean, that's the kind of thing he would do. Um, I mean, he got a kick out of the fact that I wrote these tomes. I mean, I've done 15 books, and a lot of them are big fat books that some one my first one, my friends, it was called The Man Who Knew Too Much, and my friends called it The Book That Grew Too Much. It was about the Kennedy assassination. And so I remember at one point James's wife Margot says, "Well, do you write in the morning?" And James just looked at me and he said, "No, he writes all day to finish these tomes." Right. So I mean, he was just fun to be around, and but also, I mean, I remember when he came to visit we have a place in Los Angeles where I live, and I remember walking in to see him, and he said, what do you do on a sinking ship? Do you pray? He was talking about the Titanic, comparing our times. This was the early 2000s, to the time when the Titanic went down, and the Bush administration was in power then. But we were already seeing the beginnings, certainly, if not more than the beginnings of what, this kind of crazy world we're living in today, with democracy in great crisis, and the potential of, authoritarianism and AI and all these threats that we're looking at as a society. But he was tuning into those things, long before, and we would have conversations about that. And so it was, it was a great privilege to be around him. And the way the biography happened again was very, I don't know, I mean, what to call it. I certainly did not intend to, I never felt qualified. I wasn't, like I say, a psychologist. But early in 2004, so we've known each other then for off and on for about 5 years. And his older sister came to visit their home in Connecticut. They live on this kind of this farm, really, and lovely old farmhouse, big place in Thompson, Connecticut. And she was there and was telling these great stories about the growing up years in Atlantic City, where James's parents, his father owned a hotel on the Atlantic City boardwalk, and so he grew up in the 1920s in this fabulously extroverted world of, the high flying whatever, and so his sister was talking about this, and I said afterwards, "Wow, she's such a great storyteller. you should get some of her stories on tape while she's still with us. And so this gave him the idea to bring all of the siblings together. He had three siblings and all of his kids, as many as he had 4 kids, as many as who could come that summer to the place, their home, and film it and talk about the early years, the ancestors, all kinds of interesting stuff. So a member of my family, a young lady, came to do the filming, and my wife Alice was there, and his wife Margot, and they got talking afterwards. Was James ever going to do a biography? And I guess it came down to, well, if he really didn't want to do that, particularly, he never had. He didn't even want his picture on his books. He wanted everything to be about the work, really. And he eschewed personalistic biography, did not like it. Mm-hmm. But they kind of said, well, maybe he's 21 years older than I, so he was in his 70s, and I was 57 at the time, that maybe I should do it. And so I did. And it took from the very beginning, I remember him looking at me and saying, this will take years, don't give up your day job, keep writing on other subjects, which I did. I was finishing a book about saving a fish, about the Atlantic striped bass. I ended up doing, in the course of writing this biography series, 5 books with, of all people, Jesse Ventura, the wrestler turned governor of Minnesota, who I happened to run into by accident in Mexico. And we ended up doing all this work together and writing a lot about the environment. So, it did take a long time. I originally just intended to write 1 volume. And he would work closely with me in the sense that he never censored what I was writing but he would always, I would show him the chapters as I wrote them. And then he would expand on the themes, which was just wonderful, to actually have him, because new things would come to mind about the places he'd lived and where he'd grown up and the importance of ancestors. And this was mostly around volume 1. But anyway, it was a tremendous privilege to actually be able to sit with him and do many interviews. And not always easy at all, because I had to learn a whole new field basically in the course of this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because he famously wasn't interested in personal biography, like in terms of the therapeutic process. He even said at one point, I remember, like, I don't care about origin stories, something like that, like,
Yeah.
And so to then see this like massive biography of him come out, I was wondering like what his initial reactions to it were, and if there was resistance to him speaking about himself in such depth. And because a lot of the people that he came up with too are still around. And so is there any concern about revealing too much, because he's been a controversial figure in the Jungian and wider psychological world, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And he never really held back. I mean, and he decided, okay, if he was going to do this, he was going to talk about a big aspect of his psychology, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers know, is that he was all about the growth of the soul by growing down, basically, like paying attention to the symptom, not trying to cure yourself. He was opposed to the way most current therapy happens. He didn't disdain it completely. He was a therapist himself for many years, never my therapist, but very helpful to me. We can talk about that in a minute in terms of my son. But he so it was pathology that interested him. It was mythology, and how we have all these different gods that inhabit us, and we have to get to know them, and we have to get to know the darker parts of ourselves. But he looked at it differently, I would say, than Jung, who he knew in Switzerland, and I write about that quite a bit in volume 1. Jung was all about individuation, the self, learning more about who we are by delving into the unconscious, of course. But James took it I guess you'd say, well, Jung's was analytical psychology, and Hillman's is called archetypal psychology, because it was those archetypes that came to really to the forefront with what he was writing about. He wrote 20 books, translated into 21 languages. I mean, tremendous scholar of all kinds of things, everything from, and an emphasis later in his life on what he called anima mundi, or soul in the world. That we had to not just do finding out. It was more important than finding out, how our father or our mother affected us, whatever. It was taking that, if we delved into those things, and then using our knowledge of ourselves to make a difference in the world. To go out there and not just appreciate, first of all, the aesthetic nature, to notice what was happening around us, and then to become activists in a sense, and which he was too.
Mhm. Yeah, and very concerned with very mundane things and how they affect us, how they affect our soul. Like I remember in one workshop, maybe at the Rose Center, he got into a whole discussion with someone in the audience about this issue of, like, what about my parents and their effect on me? He said, forget about your parents. What about the strawberry at the grocery store that's tasteless and ice
Yeah,
cold, so it numbs the taste buds? Like, what about the strawberries, man? He's like so
wonderful.
emphatic. And so to hear that you met him because of an organic vegetable grocer, it was just perfect.
Yeah,
It's like he's walking the walk, he's
yeah,
looking for the fruit with flavor.
exactly. Yeah, and so I mean, of course, it was very difficult. He died in 2011, in October, the end of October, and then I had always thought I would just write one big book, or that would be it. But there was so much that we were not able, that we talked about, but the, it was just too much to contain in one volume. So we'd agreed before he passed that I would write a second volume. And then as time went by and I worked on that, it became clear that I couldn't contain everything I wanted to say about him, and the incredible breadth of his psychology and his vision in that. So both volumes 2 and 3 are coming out this year, which I've been working on, off and on for 20 years now, almost. And without him around, I mean, it was a whole another challenge, because I didn't have him to bounce ideas off of, or read the chapters and tell me what he thought. And but I was going to say earlier that when he was alive, he was not he was ready to talk about the tough parts of his life. He had, for example, he was kicked out as he became director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich, the first one ever that Jung basically appointed him to, before Jung died in 1961. And so he was really running the show there, and getting ready to create Archetypal Psychology with Pat Barry and Rafael Lopez Pedraza and others. But he had an affair with a patient, and ended up being savagely attacked for that by, among others, C.A. Meyer, who was sort of Jung's right-hand man for many, many years, and was a therapist, and was himself had had an affair with Hillman's wife, Kate. So here's this hypocritical guy, going after Hillman to get rid of him, and covering up his own situation in life. So, but it was being dismissed as director of studies in late '69, I think, or 1970, that really opened the door for him. He stayed on in Zurich, and eventually got married to Pat Barry, who was a student there at the time at the Jung Institute, and became a tremendous working colleague as well as his wife. And so they began to formulate at the Warburg Institute in London what became known as archetypal psychology, incorporating, again, mythology and the aesthetic, and looking to take psychology in a whole new direction.
Hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about? Because people might have the image of a bunch of intellectuals sitting around a conference table, sharing papers and things. But the stories that I've heard, it's more like these dinners that would get really out of hand, like around the second bottle of wine, and they start throwing out ideas. And
Yeah.
can you give us a kind of a taste of what he recollected about those times?
Yeah, well, I mean, there were amazing times, and there was a group of students that mostly young guys, but also some women who had gathered in Zurich to attend the Jung Institute, that just sort of coming out of the whole hippie culture, just roaming around and discovering Jung and wanting and eventually many of them became psychologists themselves or psychiatrists. And so they would have these nights it was called Spring House. So they'd all gather in this, around this big, this table and all these chairs, and they would drink wine. And Rafael Lopez Pedraza was this wild Cuban, brilliant man in his own right. Very close friend of Hillman's in those days, and they would dive into really esoteric subjects, like Don Camillo's memory theater from the Renaissance era, and the great Italian astrologer scholar Ficino, and going all the way back to the Greeks, and so they were finding these esoteric texts, and the Picatrix was another one, and they would analyze them, and have come to these conclusions all these years later, like reviving this amazing tradition that once had existed and flourished in a much earlier century. So that was how archetypal psychology really came to be. And then he took over Spring Publications, which had been started by Jane Pratt with Jung sometime before, and attending these annual gatherings at what's called Eranos. And it was this pretty magical place, actually, in southern Italy, around this beautiful lake, where these sort of underground scholars would gather, invited from various disciplines. There was Gershom Scholem, there was Adolf Portman, a biologist, Henry Corban, an incredible scholar of Islam and mysticism. And so Hillman was younger, and he was invited to be the psychologist presenting. Jung had started this in the 1930s. And so he was carrying on this tradition, and it was really quite a place. I mean, I went to one of the big parts of the biography is letters that I was able to gather from all these different amazing people that James had known and I'd interviewed, and they saved their letters, and they allowed me to photocopy them. And so there was a whole trove of these at Eranos, and I went there and kind of had this strange experience, one among many, but I spent the night, I think it was the room where Jung once stayed and where Hillman had stayed when he was a guest there, speaker. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was totally not in another world really, but I had tremendous dizzy spells. I could not get out of bed. I couldn't make it across the room. This had never happened to me before in my life, but it was really disorienting. And I finally overcame it, but it was like something in that place, the spirit of that place was like really powerful and as well as remarkably beautiful.
When you're kind of kept in your bed, any strange dreams or visions while you were there? I
was trying to remember the other day. Not that immediately came to mind. I didn't like see spectral people or anything, but I have had those. I mean, I've had amazing dreams about James through the years, and very, very powerful. And he opened my life up in just remarkable ways, which we can talk about along this journey. I mean, I remember at the very beginning of it, he said, "Welcome, traveler," because he knew that there was no way I was going to be able to write a book about him without exploring some really deep and sometimes dark parts of my own psyche. And so that is indeed what happened.
Oh, amazing. I'm interested to know about the process. Like when he was alive, how do you begin writing a biography of someone like him? Like, do you have sessions where you sit down and you go, okay, let's talk about the early years? So how do you open up the conversation? Or like, what are the significant memories, or do you go chronologically? How did the process work?
Well, at first we did go chronologically because the ancestors were very important to him. Their pictures were on the room that I stayed in when I went to Thompson and interviewed him. All the ancestors going back like, I don't know, 4 or 5 generations were on the walls, and their presences were very real to him, guiding ghosts, and And so we talked a lot about that, and I did a long chapter about his ancestral history on both sides. His grandfather on one side was a very famous Reform rabbi, Joseph Krauskopf, and then on the other side, was the hotel world that he grew up in Atlantic City. He really wanted to get into Atlantic City too, and what that was like, because it combined sort of the extroverted world of that place of the 1920s with the very introverted world that existed in the winters when he would just walk his dog alone along the beach, and so there was both of these. And of course he said the characters he met were just tremendous fuel for the psyche, for a psychological mind. And so he from the very beginning wanted to talk about his soul's code in that sense. And then we did take it chronologically. We traveled together. We went to Ireland, where he'd gone to Dublin. In Dublin, he attended Trinity College and gotten to know J.P. Donlevy, the novelist, became his best friend. He wanted to be a novelist himself in the beginning. Before he went there, he was in the Navy, and it was the end of World War II. And because his eyesight was poor, he wasn't allowed to actually, wasn't in combat, but he became it was his first therapeutic experience because he was taking care of soldiers who had come back, Navy men, who suffered from blindness or deafness. And he had just amazing, experiences with these people. Then got tuberculosis not too long after that, had to be, in the sanitarium for a while. Went to Trinity College, had met this beautiful young woman, Kate Kempe from Sweden, when he lived in Paris during the era of the existentialists in the late 40s before he went to Dublin. And started a literary magazine in Dublin. And then ended up traveling in Africa and then living in Kashmir for about 2 years, I think, with Kate before they got married. And ending up going to the Jung Institute really because he was having a breakdown. I mean, he at his wedding, actually, he was having this really, pretty rough breakdown. He had a vision. Well, here's what happened. He met this guru, I guess you'd say, named Gopi Krishna, and when he was in Kashmir, and who told him, go to the mountain, go into Tibet, you'll have this. That's where the vision will come to you. The great picture of life is going to come to you. So he got up there on the mountaintop and waiting for the incredible dream to happen, and the dream was his mother and his grandmother lying in bunk beds. And I mean, this sent him down the mountain. I mean, he sent him actually into analysis at the Jung Institute. I mean, it was such a shock to his psyche, I guess. And so he then
not the grand vision he expected.
Not the grand vision he expected at all, but a life-changing event for him. And he did go through what's called the Kundalini experience, where which this Gopi Krishna had talked to him about, and eventually did a book called Kundalini about, the energy coming up through your spinal column and shaking you to your core. I mean, it's a whole story, but
yeah. Well, just to interject, for people listening who don't know, Hillman wrote a commentary on Gopi Krishna's Kundalini book,
exactly,
which is fascinating.
Yeah. Yes, he did. That was one of his early books, I think 1967. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he comes down from the mountain and he's getting married, which would cause any Puer to have a breakdown, I would think.
Yeah.
Commitment. One woman.
Right. I mean, he was definitely, he wrote a lot about Puer and Senex, and felt like all his life he was a Puer, that always the youthful idealist on the one hand, but needing the Senex discipline on the other. But he said he thought a lot of his books were probably a justification of his Puer behavior when he was first writing them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the way he wrote, so you have a capacity to write these long books focused around one subject, but he wrote kind of small pieces that were collected into a number of of works, of course, but they were kind of like he's jumping around from topic to topic. Like he's
Yeah.
very much the Puer, and his writing style reflected, I think, the way his mind worked.
Hmm. Yeah, he covered everything, and he researched everything, in Oxford, and very scholarly work on betrayal. He wrote an amazing essay on betrayal in the mid 1960s. His um, first book, which was his thesis at the University of Zurich, was called Emotion, and he said, he wrote it because he was having trouble getting to his own, emotions, and he was exploring that in a very archetypal and intellectual way. So yeah, he wrote about everything. I mean, he just later I write about in volume two when he lived in Dallas. He left Zurich after 25 years and moved to Dallas, Texas, of all places, and connected there with the university first as a professor, and then starting the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. And there, he wrote at length and gave lectures about the soul of architecture, city and soul. What could we wrote about ceilings, wrote about, things that we could do to make city life more appealing aesthetically. And that was when he also sort of dove into this idea of anima mundi, soul in the world, and how we needed to notice our environment and become, connected to it. And so that's he followed this fascinating thread his entire life.
Mhm. Well, going back to that question, what do you do on the sinking ship? When the ship's going down, what do you do? And I think you spoke about that in terms of like doing psychotherapy, like kind of ego-centered, individualist psychology in these windowless clinical rooms. Meanwhile, the ship is going down.
Right.
And so did he have another answer for that? Like, what do we do when the ship is going down? Um, we get out of the room and what? See if we can bail some water while it's going down, or do we go down with the band playing us out, or you know?
Well, you dive in. I think it's that you dive into whatever aspect of the culture is yours. I mean, he did a lot of the outdoor work. He was a gardener. He planted trees around his place in Connecticut, and explored the environment. Spoke about it a lot at seminars and people getting out there and getting involved. And so I think he saw it as something that was vital for people to do in whatever way they were moved to do it. And but beyond getting stuck in themselves and always looking for something, connecting to people with real relationships, and he was very much um, someone who believed in community, that we needed to come together to get things done, and so that's why he was really pretty fascinated with how I live, because I've lived in a communal setting for much of my life, and and he was really really fascinated by that, and very much a pushing for those kinds of involvements for people.
Mhm. Yeah, get out and tend to the soul of the world,
Yeah,
something like that in whatever capacity that is. And he wasn't snobbish about the way that you would do that either, right? Um, like the organic grocer was
yeah,
probably doing exactly what he was put here to do in a way.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that's certainly true. And he also felt like we had to come to terms with. He was always going to the core of subjects, like even about war. His final book, which I write about in volume three, was A Terrible Love of War, which writing that for him that's when I was first getting to know him, and it was excruciating. I mean, he fell down, hit his head. I mean, he was like, you know, really suffering the agonies of the battlefield, and writing about how we could not be rid of war. He toured the Civil War battlefields. He walked all over them with this old friend of his from Ireland, Kenny Downey, to feel what it took, to feel wow, this is the soil on which thousands of American men fought each other and died for the sake of the Union. What did that mean? You know, he explored that. He explored the meaning of war to soldiers and the camaraderie that exists. And he wasn't extolling war, but he was saying we've got to understand in a sense, that there is also beauty in it to people, and people are driven to do it. So why is that? We can't just get rid of it. We can't say, oh, let's just have peace. I mean, he had a big debate with Deepak Chopra once about this. You know, who was very much on the other, feeling like we can get to peace in our time by meditating, which that helps. But um, he was
Mm.
taking those kinds of subjects and really forcing an examination. They weren't always popular either. I mean, a lot of people didn't want to hear about that.
Yeah. I didn't know that he was into boxing, which helps me feel more of an affinity with him because I love martial arts and boxing.
Yeah.
Uh, it totally makes sense though, because he was such an intellectual pugilist. Like I think he said once that he can only write when he's angry.
Yeah.
And like he used to quote, I think it was Heraclitus that said like hate is the father of all things, or something like that. Like strife is what begins creation.
Hmm.
And so he really had that Mars aspect.
Mars is
So
hugely important to him. Yes.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think he said sometimes that he was a child of Mars.
Yeah. He did. He did, and he talked about that in lectures, and didn't. I remember one lecture I went to back way back 2003 or something, and a very new age kind of woman was up there talking about, oh, how spiritual a man he was, and we must bring our bodies to this event, and James's wife Margot says, aren't they already here? And then he got up there in front of this audience that had been, kind of lulled by this beautiful talk, and he said, I feel oppressed, and launched into what he had to talk about. So yeah, and he when he was a teacher in his earlier years, I mean, students were often kind of terrified of him because he just did not settle for fools. Tolerate fools gladly, as the phrase goes. He would let you have it if you said something stupid. He mellowed as he got older, and part of that mellowing, I think he had a remarkable experience spending a number of years in the so-called men's movement.
Yeah,
And
I was going to say I've reflected on this with other people who were around that movement, and I think it did kind of temper him in a way because he was in an environment that he wasn't really accustomed to. Like it was not so intellectual; it was more kind of body and feeling oriented. Um, yeah, and I could hear it in his lectures at those Minnesota men's conferences. You can hear
mm,
the more humility and kind of self-deprecation and maybe trying to actually win the audience of men over. I can pick up on that because I've listened to so many hours of him in different kind of modes. But yeah, please say more about that and if he had any reflections on that.
oh yeah, he really wanted that to. Really wanted to talk about that and the importance of it in his life and for the culture in general. Because he was one of the teachers. It was called the what he was part of was called the mytho-poetic men's movement, and they used eventually Robert Bly, the poet, and Michael Meade, storyteller, who emphasized fairy tales with these groups of gatherings of men in the woods of Mendocino and Minnesota and elsewhere. And James was the intellectual. He talked about ideas, and he also talked about raw subjects. I mean, it was all very and it was often characterized by the big media as, oh, this is just a group of guys, beating drums and going off to talk about their wives in some kind of disparaging way in the woods, right? For a week, which it was 100 men often coming together, but it was so far from that. It was really deep talk, getting to all kinds of subjects that you were afraid to talk about, using fairy tales and mythology to find yourself in a particular story that you'd never heard before, and and making masks together, and there was one that they did where you had to one of the men would be blindfolded and you would have to lead him into the woods or wherever you were going. And of course, for James, he wept. I mean, he'd been reminded him of his days in the Navy when he had been taking care of these blind soldiers, and and his son came, and there was it was not an easy thing for them. His son I've interviewed at some length, but it wasn't easy for him growing up, being the son of this great thinker, and who was often distant in that sense. But boy, they really went through it, at the men's gathering, and Lawrence Hillman became an archetypal astrologer. Came to appreciate, that he said, as he said, grew up marinated in archetypal stuff that led him to what he was going to do in life. So yeah, I mean, there's so many stories. And James would do things like, at first he had a hard time. Just some of the men wonder, what's this guy doing here? This egghead, intellectual philosopher, but they all came to so appreciate who he was, and he would do things like when they challenged him at one of these very early events by sending this guy into the room when James was talking, completely naked, and the guy comes in and just sits down in a chair. So what did Hillman do? He just looked over there. And he said, and everybody's kind of snickering and everything. He says, "Would you stand up, please?" So he just would throw the challenge back and take it in, and came to just cherish these gatherings. And I've been to one. I went to one in Mendocino, which I found very, very powerful. Later, I mean, I wasn't there at one that he was at, because I didn't know anything about it in those years. But it truly is quite a thing to go through. And there was one in 1991 where 50 black men and 50 white men all came together in the woods of West Virginia. It's called Buffalo Gap. And wow, they got into some stuff. Some of them were from the Deep South, had very racist backgrounds. James Hillman gave a talk called Notes on White Supremacy. At that meeting, a man named Malidoma Somé, who was from West Africa, for the first time told his story. And it was an incredible story. I'm just going to quickly summarize it. He wrote a book called Of Water and the Spirit later about it. But he spoke of when he was a boy. He grew up in Burkina Faso in West Africa and was taken from his village when he was like 4 years old and raised by the Jesuits. He forgot his native language, knew, I guess, knew obviously English or French. I think it was the French from the Jesuits. And then he escaped when he was in his early 20s and made his way back to his village, hundreds of miles away. Was not accepted because, he didn't even know anything about the language, or it was a Dagara tribe, actually. So he went through the initiation that usually young men go through, or boys go through when they're like 13, 14, when he was 21, and became someone that his grandfather who had foreseen, which was he who makes friends with the stranger. And he ended up going to the Sorbonne, where he's educated, Boston University, and becoming a healer, a shaman, who was bringing that culture in a very profound way to the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, Dick, obviously you're a natural storyteller, because I really don't have to do much in terms of segue, but I would like to talk about both how Malidoma and Hillman played a part in your relationship with your son, Franklin, who I guess was diagnosed with schizophrenia around the time he was 17. And
yeah.
So where would that put us? Is that late 90s, early 2000s?
That was like the late 90s, 1996, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And,
So you had already met Hillman and were friends with him. And
I had not met him yet.
Okay.
I had met him 2 years later. And then there was one time when I was up visiting him. This was, I think, around the time I started the biography, perhaps. And James picked up on the fact that I was troubled, and he said, something's off, something's wrong, and what is it? And is it your son? And I said, yeah, it was. That I was really having a hard time because I couldn't handle what's called the delusions. He would just go out there, right? And so, oh, I built this house over here. I did this, and at the same time, he was remarkably psychic. I mean, he could, read my thoughts. He was sort of shamanic in his own way, which I didn't really know anything about that yet. But and what James Hillman told me that day, I never forgot. It was that he said, yeah, you can just go on like that, and you're the father, you know better, but maybe you could just go with it. Open yourself to following him wherever he's going. Talk about what you're doing that day, and even if he dismisses it and makes up some story about it, you still, it's a conversation that you're having. And he said more than that. I mean, he said it much more profoundly than I'm saying it here. But I know that once I did that, tried that, it completely changed the relationship with Frank. And suddenly we could have fun with this stuff. Some of it, we could play with it. We could be in a restaurant. He liked these Asian restaurants. And I remember one time he started to talk to the waiter in made up Chinese, and the waiter didn't know what to do, and he was kind of wandering around. And and uh, and then he came back by the table, and Franklin pointed at me. And he said, "Oh," he said, "don't worry." He said, well, "we're speaking Mandarin, but he only understands Cantonese." In other words, I wouldn't get the conversation, right? So, and we just laughed. I mean, so we could have fun with those kinds of things, and that was the beginning of what later became a what can I call it? I guess a shamanic quest. I mean,
Mhm.
after
Well,
James Hillman died in 2011, a year later, I was very desperate and seeking at least an adjunct to conventional psychiatric medication, which was really debilitating in a lot of ways and put tremendous weight gain on people who took it. And, I just didn't know what to do. And in the course of that, my wife suggested, well, why don't you contact Malidoma Somé? Now, I had interviewed him, and James Hillman had talked to him about him with me when he was alive, that he felt it was very important that I include Malidoma in the biography. So I
right.
interviewed him
Okay.
on the
Yeah.
phone.
So you interviewed Malidoma about the Hillman biography and
Yeah,
about their time in the men's movement together. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. So, because they'd gotten to know each other well, and Malidoma had great respect for James, and vice versa.
Mhm.
And so I contacted him and came to California to do a divination with him. And that was the beginning of an amazing process that I chronicled later in a book called My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism.
Mm. Well, one of the kind of most common criticisms I hear about Hillman is that yeah, he's full of like wonderful ideas, but they're not very practical. They're like hard to apply to psychotherapy. And people say, well, he wasn't really practicing psychotherapy for the second half of his life. He'd given it up. And as he said, he was doing a therapy of ideas. Uh, and I disagree because I think his ideas are all about your orientation, your attitude, your approach to anyone with any kind of problems. And so one of the guiding principles is to follow the symptom.
Yep,
Another guiding principle is stick with the image. So don't
yep,
get into analyzing or interpreting whatever comes up in a dream or a fantasy, but stay with it, and maybe it has something to tell you. So it's very much like I don't know how you characterize it, but it's a go with the flow kind of an attitude. And so I'm really fascinated by his practical advice to you as a friend in how to deal with your son, who is coming up with all these like fantastic scenarios and is kind of like in his own fantasy world.
yeah,
Um, and so it sounds like it was like really good advice and counter to what you had been doing already or what you'd been told to do.
absolutely.
Really going with what was presenting with Franklin, if you want to call them symptoms of his schizophrenia, which I have a hard time with those diagnoses, but
Yeah. Oh yeah, and it was just real basic, basic advice. I'll read you one just paragraph from what he said to me because it was really quite amazing. Um, yeah, well, he says you probably have to reconstellate the relationship, not in terms of where you're trying to help him and not trying to get anywhere with him. Simply, you know where I was today? I went to Connecticut. You let go of his being a quote sick man. Then you may find he tells you things that he doesn't talk about otherwise. You don't know what's going to come out, but it's almost as if you've abandoned being the responsible father because you can't move him. Okay, so that's over with. Make him feel that you really want to see him and tell him things. You say, this guy drove by and I thought, I wish Frank had seen that car. What did you think of that kind of car? He might go into a delusion about the car, but it doesn't matter. You've approached him differently from the therapeutic. So, I mean, that's pretty incredible, isn't it?
So not treating him as a sick person, as someone with the problem.
Yeah,
And obviously then at that point, you're the person who doesn't have the problem, who's trying to help him, and how that creates a certain dynamic. And like one of the quotes I remembered from your account is he said, respect resistance,
yes,
right?
right.
So if you approach him in a certain way and Franklin is throwing up all kinds of resistance, maybe even getting angry with you, respect that. Now,
Yeah.
what did that mean to you in not just how you understood it, but how it showed up in the relationship?
Well, as I said, I think it really changed the dynamic, because I accepted that there were parts of, I just accepted him who he was. And I also, at the same time, began to really deeply appreciate qualities he had, what he had to teach me about life, not just what the father can impart to the son, but what is the son really trying to tell me? And I mean, he turns out to, he's a remarkable artist. When he was younger, he was an incredible writer. And then he began to write sort of in other languages and write hieroglyphics and, all these kinds of things that I really had a hard time relating to. But I also came to just appreciate his vision and how he was connected to other worlds in ways that were mysterious to me, but I believed were real. They were certainly real to him,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't like delusions that were meaningless. Occasionally, he would have conversations. I'd overhear conversations he was having with an invisible entity, and I mean, this is often dismissed, I think, in with so-called schizophrenics as oh, they're hearing voices. Well, it wasn't quite like that. He was really having conversations that were to him certainly meaningful and able to start to move through the world in a different way, especially once he was appreciated, he was recognized, he was respected. His resistance to being a regular person was respected. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like asserting his uniqueness and eccentricity, which
Yeah,
Hillman was all about, is like allowing for the eccentric.
right, exactly. Hillman had so many friends like that, by the way. I mean, just odd people, that he was attracted to and worked with, and
Well, they're the most interesting people.
yeah, exactly. And he he loved the eccentric, and he was eccentric himself, in certain ways.
And so why he would have reaction to showing up at I don't know, some kind of retreat center, maybe the Omega Institute or something, and the person introducing him doing a kind of a centering exercise,
Right.
and and then he gets up there, and of course the Puer in him is just going to want to decenter everything and throw it off
Yeah.
kilter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, yeah. One time we sat down. There was a period of the biography where you asked me earlier, did we follow a chronological path? And in some ways we did. But then, and volume three becomes much more like this. We began to just. I went to see him one day. He said, "Let's just talk about themes." And then he gave me actually a homework assignment, which was he asked me to list what I found the 8 essential themes of his work.
Hmm.
which I did, and I recently dug it out. I'm not going to read all these, elaborate on these, but the first was an emphasis on soul rather than ego and self that includes embracing its pathologies rather than trying to, quote, cure them. Again, as you said, the importance of images and coming to what he called a poetic basis of life in words, in our dreams and fantasies, in seeing through to a deeper understanding. Images as living realities through the realms of literature, art, myth, and alchemy. And following from that, an emphasis on the aesthetic and the sense of beauty, noticing what's around us. And then connecting classical mythology with contemporary psychology. Then engaging Jung and reworking his psychology. The importance of anima mundi, as I mentioned, the soul in the world, and the shadow that exists in therapy itself. Mm-hmm. Its emphasis on the subjective and the scientific, and it's what he called redemptive Christianism, and its institutionalization as a profession where it loses its roots in cultural criticism. So mm-hmm. I presented that to him, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he was not displeased.
So, right. Something like, "Oh, sounds pretty good."
Yeah, sounds pretty good to me. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, something in there too. Maybe this could be fit under the anima mundi, but toward the end of his life, I really feel like he was really strongly promoting a civic responsibility, like we were talking about before, that engagement with your local community, like not trying to save the world, but just do your part where you're at, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he did himself. He was got very first when I first met him, he was involved in a fight to stop this the sewer development in his small town, and I put him in touch with a friend of mine from the EPA and things like that. So yeah, and neighbors that wanted to bring down trees that he thought were beautiful or something, he would take this up and take them on and fight it. So yeah, exactly. It was like you kind of engage where you are, notice and appreciate where you are, and go from there.
Now, this journey with Franklin, your son, and Malidoma Somé in Africa, I'm looking at the time. I know it's a big story, and you, like you said, you have a whole book about it, and it's so fascinating to me. But I'm wondering if you can kind of tell something of that story, because we have a lot of crossover in some of the themes that we cover on the podcast in terms of depth psychology and shamanism. So, is that doable for you? Could you?
Yeah, I can do that. I can offer a few stories that illuminate. Well, I when I first met Malid.
Yeah, I was going to say you did mention, I kind of interrupted when you were saying that you had reached out and contacted Malidoma, who you'd met through the writing of Hillman's biography. So maybe pick up there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to see him in Ojai, California, and I did a divination, which is, as people may know, but it's a divination cloth where you move a series of, there's stones and there's bones and rings and, lots of objects on there, pieces of wood, and you move them with your strong hand in a clockwise direction if you're male. And then he reads the pattern and he sees things, in the pattern. So one of the major things that he saw was, in terms of Franklin, who is biracial, he said, your ancestors don't really know who he is, and they need to give him a place at the table. So he presented me a series of rituals that I did, and they involved, bringing apple cider vinegar and rum and various things to the beach and sending them, throwing them into the water, kernels of corn, and invoking the spirit of my ancestors. And then I'll tell this story. It's quite a. Let's see if I can condense it. There came a time when I took Franklin to meet him in Jamaica. They hit it off beautifully, and Franklin loved Malidoma, and Malidoma recognized him. Because in African Dagara culture, there's not that, sometimes you could consider the shaman to be schizophrenic or vice versa. And there's actually a great appreciation for for that, because it's in the spiritual realm. So I was sitting with Malidoma, and something not he wasn't happy with what he saw in this particular divination evening, and he said to me that there's something I feel you have to do, and you have to go. You have to first obtain a slave shackle, and then you have to take it to the Atlantic, to the Middle Passage, where the ancestors on Franklin's mother's side crossed. And you have to throw that shackle into the sea. You have to bridge the gap between the ancestors on Franklin's mother's side and the ancestors on your side. And I thought to myself, how the hell am I going to do that? This sounds crazy to me. But I did obtain a slave shackle. You know where I found it? Was on eBay.
Of course. Yeah.
And I bought it for $300. And when it arrived, it was in a box. I was living in Boston at the time, and I couldn't open it.
Oof. Yeah.
And I kept it on my desk. And eventually I took Franklin with me he was living in Boston, Ventura, and Cambridge. And we went to see his mom in Baltimore. And I thought, that's where I'll do it, somewhere there, because that was where her ancestral heritage crossed a long time ago. And so I went out one morning just by myself, and I drove to Cambridge, Maryland. On my way, I stopped at the birthplace of Frederick Douglass to see if maybe that was the right place. I was not greeted warmly there by the white trash family that lived there. I went on to the river where Douglass used to fish when he was a boy, and it was there that I opened the box, and I took out this shackle and I held it, and it sat in the seat next to me for a while. And then I went on to Cambridge, and I went to the Harriet Tubman Museum there, and watched a movie about Harriet Tubman. And then there was one plaque on the wall, and I went up to the plaque and I read it, and it was a reward from 1850 for an escaped mulatto slave and his family being issued by the slaveholder, and it was signed by a man named William Russell. And I'd never found that person in my ancestry, but you can imagine it really did me a turn. I mean, it shook big time. Same last name. And I found a boat, a ship that was going out in the morning, a replica of an 1812 sailing ship, and I booked a passage on it. And I spent that night there, and then I really went through it the next morning. I was holding this shackle in my hands. I was crying. I was, didn't know. I was kind of out of time. I called my wife, and after I got off the phone, my watch, which I've had on my wrist forever, stopped, and it wouldn't start again. So it was like I was in another time zone, time dimension. When I left that room, on TV, there was Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about reparations for slavery.
Oh.
So I went to the water's edge, and I did a ritual there with milk, pouring some milk into the water, and got on the ship, and I had the shackle in my black bag, and I didn't know how I was going to do this. And we went out on the Chesapeake Bay, and there was 30 people on the ship, this big tourist ship. And finally I saw an opening up toward the bow, and I went up there and I took the shackle out, and I threw it. I said, "Take it, water spirit," and I threw it over the edge of the boat, and something happened. I don't know what it really was, but it was a release, some kind of energy. I don't know if it was in the ancestral world or it was just in me, or it was very strange. And it led to eventually taking Franklin and my ex-wife, his mother, to Burkina Faso for a month-long healing ritual with a shaman a healer that Malidoma had found there, and visiting Malidoma's village with him. And there was a bunch of other people on the trip too, but we basically, we had these big medicine pots that were divined for us, and we went through this series of rituals with those, bathing, drinking the water, going through rituals involving animal sacrifice. I'm not going to go into the whole thing right now, but I wrote about it, and it was transformative. Um, Perhaps in part, certainly because we were doing it together as a family, but also, for Franklin to do this and spend time in that situation was hugely significant. And he went off all his medication after that for a period of time, little by little, with his doctor's permission. Eventually, when he went off all of it, he had a crash. So he had to go back on some, but he's so much better than he's been since he had a breakdown at 17. And James Hillman had told me that often schizophrenia relaxes its hold on someone as they get older, which I think certainly in his case is true. But he's doing great. He's in his 40s now. He lives with his mom in Baltimore and does a lot of really amazing art and sculpture. And I couldn't be happier with how all this turned out.
You said that month-long ritual was transformative. How did it transform you and maybe your view of Franklin and his condition?
Well, certainly I saw a tremendous change in his condition. It was visible. And we just went through together, like a bull was sacrificed for us in this little village. And the bull had like become, we were actually attached to it. We each had a bull of our own. It was, I don't know, people may think that's crazy, but I mean, it was deeply profound for this to happen. And, we went through it together.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a whole new culture where there was definitely I hate to even use the word otherworldly, but there was a spiritual component that was so ancient and so deeply meaningful, certainly to my son, that I had never appreciated in the way I did. And eventually, I later, I never wrote about this yet, but I did have to, at an ancestralization gathering that Malidoma had in North Carolina, I confronted an ancestor in my deep past who had been a slaveholder. I saw him. I broke down. I went through a lot over that.
Mm-hmm. Was there something about seeing Franklin in a completely different cultural context, like one that recognized him and maybe even saw him, like there was a place for him, like in that culture, in that understanding?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we met with more than one healer, and they definitely recognized these qualities in him that were familiar to them, and and that was very meaningful to him. I mean, I had taken Franklin to Africa once before, and we'd gone through a lot, just the two of us there, back 4 years before this. And it was a long process, a process of for me coming to I don't know that I can honestly say understand is the word, but appreciate the qualities that he has that are beyond mine, different than me, beautiful in their own way. And
mm-hmm.
It's he's 44 now, and I'm 76, and still exploring in different realms. And I think I would certainly never have wished everything that Franklin's gone through in his life on him. I mean, it's really been a rough road, a lot of it. But he's, in the course of that, he's come out of it a very kind person with a lot of empathy and compassion for people that is admirable to me.
Hmm. Hmm. There's so much more there than just like acceptance of his difference or his suffering. The appreciation,
Yeah,
I think, is, it's something that I hear in Hillman too, is to not accept, like that's so kind of, I don't know, passive or benign, but to actually appreciate
yes,
his difference and his influence on your life and how he kind of shaped your destiny as well.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing. Well, thanks a lot for sharing that. It's just an incredible story, and I think speaks to how the ideas that Hillman was always talking about, how they can have an effect on a regular person's life in a way. Like it's not about therapy in a room and working on yourself, but it's about how to engage with life in a completely different way. And one that I think is more akin to how our pre-Christian ancestors engage with life, more of an animistic, mythic
Yeah.
mindset and way of engagement. Yeah. That's what I really feel in Hillman. And like, if he was still around, you know, there's a lot of people talking about rewilding and connecting with ancestry and all of this. And I think Hillman was always doing that, but he was doing it in a very kind of down to earth uh, way that wasn't, he wasn't making too much of it. He wasn't turning everything into some kind of some ritual performance.
No,
He was just about like approaching life in that way.
yeah, he was
Even Tom Moore has talked
remarkable.
about going shopping with him and how it was a completely different experience going shopping with Hillman, because it was all about, you know, the clothes actually speaking to him and saying, this pink tie is calling to me. I'm gotta buy it. And,
That's right.
you know,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was. It was a great privilege to have known him and an honor to have become, the man to chronicle his life as much as I could, and get to meet all the people that a lot of the people he knew who had, been influence on him, and great storytellers themselves. I mean, J.P. Dunleavy, he wrote The Ginger Man. He was. I remember when we went to see him first time was together in Ireland, and he looked at Hillman and he says, "Well, James, I don't know if I've ever met anyone who was traveling with their biographer." It's like,
la di da.
yeah, right. So I don't know. I mean, just so many rich moments, and just that I treasure, um, and he was right. The journey. I don't like that word journey that much. He didn't like it, and I'm not sure I do either. But I still use it
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah.
But it's been quite a road to have traveled with him, and it's still going on.
It's funny. Through his influence, he's made me kind of allergic to certain terms too, but I'm not ready to give up on some of them, and especially journey. I just haven't been able to come up with anything better.
I can't either really, so I'll go with it.
Sorry, Jim.
Yeah,
So when's volume 3 coming out?
it's coming out in volume two came out in May, and volume three comes out in November. So I've clearly, I didn't just suddenly finish them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but but they've been a long time coming, and yeah, they're the volume three is more thematic, although it covers the books that he wrote in his later years, which were a lot more accessible to people
Hmm.
than they were, than some of his early work, in the sense of, not that his others weren't, lay people couldn't read them. And, Revisioning Psychology was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and but The Soul's Code became a huge bestseller after he got on Oprah, a number one bestseller. And he wrote that. He wrote The Force of Character. He wrote a book about business, the business world. And then he wrote A Terrible Love of War, and then Lament of the Dead. That's a fascinating
Hmm.
thing about him too. Was in his last years, the Red Book, Jung's Red Book, was published, which was, as a lot of people probably know, this incredible book of Jung's drawings and his conversations with invisible figures like Philemon, and things that he set down that he thought, if they were published in his lifetime, people would just think he was crazy. So his family didn't let it out for a long time, and finally the Red Book came out, I think, in 2009. And when James Hillman read that, he said, "Wow, I've been fighting against so many Jungian ideas and trying to take them somewhere else." He said, "But really, Jung and I were on the same page in a lot of ways the whole time."
Yeah.
And so it was revelatory to him, and he then wrote a marvelous book with Sonu Shamdasani, his last book called Lament of the Dead, which is all about, connecting to that other world.
Yeah, it's great. He definitely revisited his feelings about Jung. And one of his last lectures, I think you can get it on YouTube. I think it's called In Defense of Jung.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Now, before we wrap up, I was going to do this with Stanton Marlin, but we didn't get to it. But I just want to share a short dream I had about Hillman, and I want to get your take because you knew him, and I want some affirmation that this was Hillman visiting me in my dreams. I just
Okay.
I want to try it out on you, see what you
Sure.
think. If
Maybe I'll
this
do the
sounds
same
like
for
him.
you.
Okay, very short. I'm in the audience at a seminar with James Hillman, and during a question and comment segment, a young man stands up and he proclaims that he does 2-hour sessions with his clients because the therapist should be commanding. Well, Hillman's clearly upset, and he asks the audience, "What rhymes with commanding?" And I shout out, "Demanding."
Yeah.
He goes, "What?" I said, "Demanding." And he points to me and he goes, "That's right, Brian." And he looks at the other guy who stood up. And he says, "Now you get the hell out of here. You're not in my style." And the guy looks crushed and humiliated and slowly creeps out of the room. And I wake up feeling so proud that Hillman has claimed me as someone in his style, which not in his school or in his club, but in his style. That to me was like, oh, I think that's something Hillman would actually say. So what do you think? Is that Hillman's spirit visiting me?
Sounds like it could be to me. Because especially you've tuned into something there about style, and because he didn't want followers. He didn't want a school, named after him. And I think he was even a little bit uncomfortable with archetypal psychology as the founder and all that kind of thing, because it wasn't just him either. There were others involved, and Pat Barry and Lopez Pedraza and others. But yeah, I think style. He was a man of style. I mean, he dressed the part. Um, he was someone who could talk to anybody on about anything. Whether it was a guy in the woods of Mendocino or Minnesota about. In fact, there was an incredible. Can I share one more thing here?
I got as much time as you have.
All right, I'm gonna read one last thing because it's something he said to a men's group, and I did come across it as I was getting ready to talk to you.
Is this in volume 2, the chapter on the men's movement?
Yeah, this is in volume 2, and it's an essay he wrote. So this is what he said. The question that we began with, and it came up again and again, is what is the conference about? What are we here for? And I think what we're about is the broken heart. And whether we feel the broken heart in our personal stories of our marriages, the deaths in the family, the Vietnam War, or the relationship with the father, there's a broken heart. And it's the broken heart of America. It's the broken heart of our society. I don't think that we should talk about the healing of the broken heart, but to realize that it is there. And that's what love is really all about. That's where love comes in, through the broken heart. Heartbreak is what it's all about. Heartbreak. What has happened here is the experiencing of the heartbreak of America. This has been something different than an experience. We have been inside the heartbreak of America. It has been personal. We each have our own piece of that heartbreak, but we also are the heartbreak. Broken, our hearts broken, and the heart of the country broken into fragments, which we call our neighborhoods, ethnic colors, and so on. And what has happened here has been that the spirits and the images that live in the heart or connect with the heart have met, and the souls have met. Maybe each of us, as embodied ego people, have not all met, and there's huge resistances in that meeting, but the souls have met and the spirits have met. It doesn't mean that they love each other. It doesn't mean that they all dance together, but they've met. And that keeps the heart alive, because it's only the heart that is isolated or sealed or complacent or self-content that isn't feeling that it is broken. It doesn't feel the heartbreak, and that is the danger. So what I want to leave with is not healing. I want to leave with that awareness of heartbreak. And I thank you for making me feel that intensely.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Perfect way to end our conversation. In honor of James Hillman and Malidoma Somé, who left us just 2 years ago now, I think.
Yes,
Coming on
terrible,
2 years.
a great loss, only 65 years old.
Yeah. And I say to Franklin too, who's also a healer and a teacher. Dick Russell, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time and everything you shared.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I really enjoyed talking with you today.